Okay, welcome, Norm, to another opportunity to interview and talk a little bit about invisible wounds, the emotional journey of a police officer's battle with PTSD. You are now at the point that you've got a lot of your books in circulation, which is great news. I'm really glad to hear that.
Yeah, great to be back. And yeah, it's I was able to bring books over to Chaps in Frederick. It's still local stores, but seems to be generating a lot of talk anyways. A lot of people talking about it, so that's great news.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's fantastic. I did have a chance to pick up a paper copy of your book, as I mentioned in one of our previous interviews, and I was really intrigued by the cover design. And we chatted, you and I chatted very casually at the bookstore one day about the cover design. And I'd love to hear more about it. And I believe that you spoke to the designer or the artist at Advocate, is where you had it printed. And can you tell us a little bit about that design and what it represents? Because when I look at it, it's somewhat of a, I don't know if you'd call it an abstract, but it's a little bit of a different representation of something, and I suspect there's meaning behind it. So can you tell that story a little bit?
Sure. Like the if you could explain it, like the darkness in the background is basically just the darkness that I went through. Then you have the blue and red light going, blue light, of course, front cover, representing the like police officers or uh, how do you say that? The thin blue line, I guess. So
Sure.
blue is part of that. Also part of the police lights flashing, and on the back cover you have the red flashing lights. So I kind of like that a lot. So the red and blue flashing lights, but at the same time, it's the blue are my brothers and sisters in blue, and the way it's kind of breaking apart
Hmm.
is you still see the center core of it that it's still intact, but the outer layers are starting to break open, and that two things is one is me losing control and breaking apart and broken as a human being, but the other part too is that it is part of my heal as well to break out, to break open those layers of always keeping it inside, and it's me breaking the outer walls open so I can actually start healing. So it's kind of it kind of has a double meaning.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. How did the artist come up with that? Is it based on, did the artist read your book, or did you describe what it was all about? And
The sales rep at Advocate, and I know this might be a kind of a marketing thing for Advocate, but I'm not a spokesperson for them. But
yeah.
he was very open to listening to what I wanted, and I kind of liked a lot of the book cover that is on Amazon for my book that's on Amazon
Right.
Books. I like the blue and red and all that, and I like the a little I shouldn't say contrast, but um, I guess the deco type of style on the book. I wanted something to really appeal, and whatever. Like he spoke to the designer, and then he came back with that a few days after, and was like, "Holy geez! Like they really exactly got what I wanted." So yeah, it was really a neat process for me to go through.
Yeah, yeah, it's really good. It's really good, and the way you described it really accurately describes, I guess, the sentiments and the feelings that you had in telling your story. So it's pretty good. It's pretty interesting. In one of our previous discussions, probably in several of our previous discussions, we talked about the titles of the chapters, and I used the word at the time that some of the titles were provocative or very interesting, and they really sort of made you look at them and say, "Oh, wonder what that's all about." Maybe this title is less provocative, I guess, to use that word, but also an interesting one. Chapter 14, you focused a lot on, well, the title, of course, was camaraderie, and it's I found that really interesting. So, can you tell us why it was important for you to etch out a chapter in your book about camaraderie and what camaraderie meant in the police force?
Uh, I thought it was an important piece because, as I guess my first psychologist explained to me, is that when you retire, there is a grieving process, and I think it's like that for most people that have an extended career in their fields.
Sure.
But in a way, in policing, and even if I might even extend that to paramedics, to firefighters, to military, correctional officers as well, even nurses, uh, because in those careers you see scenes, if I can put it that way. You observe scenes that are not meant to be seen by humans. In other words, you go into a fire, you find a burnt body. As a firefighter, it's not something that you actually, let me put it to you this way, it's not on anyone's bucket list, I'm pretty sure, as they grow older.
Of course.
Yeah, and so when I look at that, is that it forms, because you go through those extreme experiences, if I can call them that, you kind of develop that bond that you won't see, I say, and then I would be willing to even put my hand in the fire on that, that you don't see anywhere in any other careers. Unless in those careers, for example, if you're a bank teller and you have an armed robbery, everyone that is involved or a victim to this robbery will get that bond as well. That's just, I think it's, I'm not a psychologist, but I've read that in psychology articles before. It's because it's a really traumatic event and it bonds people together, the people that survive. It's no different in policing, it's just we see it more often. We see it on a regular basis. So we develop that bond fairly quickly. And that bond, when you work 28 years, like somebody like me, but it doesn't have to be 28 years, could be 10, 15 years, and even you'd get that bond. But for a person like me, if I base this from my experience, you spend 28 years, you definitely develop a very, very strong bond that is very difficult to pry away. So that for me it was an important piece, because we develop a type of camaraderie that will probably not be equal anywhere else in my lifetime. So to retire from that, and also like it's also like a very strong support group when you look at it, especially when we had those after shifts parties that I think I mentioned in my book. Is the psychologists I had in the Yukon actually pinpoint where it started to unravel in a negative way for me, is when the detachment commander had said, okay, no more, for good reason. I'm not going to get into that, but it decided that for the best for everybody, we're not going to have those after shifts anymore. So for me, and I'm sure for other police officers, to vent out during these meetings, during these choir boys meeting, if you want to put it that way,
Sure.
is it wasn't there anymore. So all the stuff that I used to process with my colleagues wasn't there anymore. So I guess I'm trying to explain in my book how camaraderie played an important role in my mental health as well. But it's also very difficult. It was a very difficult time in my life when I decided to retire. It was good for me, but it was also a very, very difficult process, because it was like losing your whole family in one shot, and just tear that Band-Aid off your arm.
Yeah, I can see that being I can relate to what you're saying about the common bond. And having been a career banker, I've been through a dozen robberies, bank robberies, and some of them were really violent. And I recall some of those ones, not in this city, but in Nova Scotia, that were violent, that a number of those people impacted, and this is a tiny scale compared to what police officers see, but those impacted, and the ones that had to go to court and identify the robber, the ones that went through that trauma and couldn't come back to work for a period of time, that group all connected with one another. They all commiserated with one another, and they can still, to this day, and I'm talking about 15 years later, a lot of us are connected on Facebook, and we still connect, which is interesting. But I think yours is probably magnified to the 100th degree compared to what I would have witnessed, or these individuals would have witnessed. So that's really something, because that camaraderie was obviously very, very, very important for you. In that chapter, in chapter 14, I wanted to read something that you said, which was sort of interesting. You said it doesn't matter what law enforcement agency you're from. And you talked about when you worked in the Yukon. You said, when I worked in the Yukon, I met an Alaska State Trooper, and we talked as if we'd been friends for years, even though we'd never met. And I found that sort of interesting because, what is it that members of the profession, whether it's RCMP or state trooper, somebody from another law enforcement agency, what is that about your profession that makes you relate so well to one another? And is that important? Is that an important thing for you?
I wouldn't say it's an important thing. I just say it's an uncommon type of feeling, I guess, if I want to put it that way. But if I would look at it, I think it's mostly it's a form of respect for knowing that that person is doing the same type of job you are, and you know what type of job it is. You know how difficult it is, how complex it is,
Yeah.
or it could be. I shouldn't say it's difficult all the time. It's not complex all the time, but it can be. And
Mhm.
I think as soon as you talk to another police officer, I think for me it was that feeling, but I'm pretty sure it would be mirrored by other police officers that, oh, another police officer. And until you get to know them better,
Mhm.
now this police officer could be the, the dirtiest cop that roams on this earth. But just the first impression thing is that he's a police officer. You offer that respect. Now, mind you, if you start to get to talk to the person and the person starts talking of all sorts of gibberish, you're going to say, "Whoa, not that." I'm not going to connect with this person.
Sure.
But I mean, for that first instant, it's definitely a form of respect.
Mhm.
After that, you get to know the person a little bit more, and then I guess you decide as a person if that person is a person you want to be connecting with. And it just happened that the sergeant there at the Alaska, what was that town called? Tok, Alaska, TOK. The sergeant there of the Alaska State Troopers, super nice guy. Liked him a lot. He actually dropped quite a lot at the our border office,
Okay.
and we used to have coffee on a regular basis there. He'd just drive down, and that was part of his territory to drive all the way down to the Canadian border.
Mhm.
And yeah, I got to know this guy very well, and super, super nice guy.
What was it like working in a more remote setting, like where you were, compared to when you worked in more urban areas where there were more people around? Was it very different policing in a remote area?
It's very, very different policing, but I loved it. I'm not a person that relishes my own privacy. I knew the type of job I had. I knew RCMP officers, most of them in Canada are rural police officers, small areas. You have to make yourself known. You have to make yourself available to the community, and that's the way I police. Not everybody would agree with me, but that's my style, and I loved it. My wife loved it, which made it a lot easier
Mhm.
on myself. But my wife's an outdoors type of person as well, so she didn't mind that at all. Actually, she loved it. But yeah, it's very different because, especially like Beaver Creek, it was only 80 in population, 90. So you get to know your people quite a lot. And I made sure that I tried to know everybody on a kind of a personal basis, not personal in the sense to really go deep, but knowing that, if I would see, for example, Rick walking on the side of the road, I know that this is Rick Vaillancourt. I know if I can talk to this person or if this person is on drugs or, and I know when to approach that person. And to me, that made my job a lot easier. And for the community, they, from what the feedback I had, I mean, for example, it's only a 2-year posting, but I could ask for an extension. Well, the extension was backed by the chief of the First Nations there in Beaver Creek. He
Okay.
sent a letter to, he sent a letter to the officer in command, the commanding officer of M Division, yeah, in the Yukon, and yeah, it was approved. So I was extended another year.
Okay.
Um, so I know some good of it came from that, from the style that I was policing. But yeah, so in a nutshell, that's pretty much it.
Yeah. Would dealing with your PTSD and coming to terms with it, would it have been different in that type of an environment than in a busy city environment or busy, crazy? And
I
you've worked in different environments like that, of course.
Yeah, I don't think I would have, even if I would have spent, for example, yeah, I think that's what the question you're
Mhm.
asking. But even if I would have spent my whole 28 years in Beaver Creek, I still would have seen some stuff.
Mm.
Maybe not as current or as often as I did when I worked in Rishabakto, for
Okay.
example. But the same can be said. I see the same thing in Rishabakto as a New York City police officer sees, but in a more extended time. So in an extended time frame. So an NYPD police officer might see what I've seen in 5 years. He might see it in a year and a half to 2 years.
Yeah. Okay.
So it all, yeah, it all depends on the area you're working with in. I mean, some New York NYPD post or precinct, they call them, might not be as busy. Of course, if you're working in the Bronx, you're going to be busier,
Mm.
or it was that actually, back in the 90s and 2000, than if you work in downtown Manhattan,
Yeah.
where all the business districts were and all that, or they are. So I think it's all like it depends on the it's all yeah, it depends on the perspective of it. I mean, it depends where you work. You could work in an area that's 10,000 in population and be less busy than an area that's 5,000. It all depends on the geographical area and what type of culture is involved there. And there's a lot of factors that are involved. But in
Mm.
a nutshell, it doesn't matter where you work. You're going to see some stuff that, in my opinion, shouldn't be seen, but somebody has to see it. And unfortunately, police officers, firefighters, paramedics, even correctional officers, military, they see stuff like that.
Mm. Yeah. Before we leave the topic of the camaraderie, because I find that quite interesting, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that. And as you know, in our last connection, we did a follow-up to how everything impacted family members, and we had the pleasure and the opportunity to meet with your wife Sandra, with your son Sean, and to talk about them. And then the follow-up, of course, we talked about a few things, your observations and your thoughts about that. And you talk in your book about making your wife mad by not being open with her, because you were sort of isolating yourself more and more every day. But when those colleagues, back to the camaraderie, I guess, when those colleagues might drop by for a beer, for a drink or something, and you said all the work stories would come out. And did you realize at that time that maybe that was having an impact on Sandra, that, you weren't talking to her about it. You might have bottled up some of those thoughts, but when somebody came by, a buddy and somebody you work with that understood, you would talk about those stories would come out. Did you realize at the time, I suspect you didn't mean to, but did you realize that it might be having an impact on your family?
I think in those years, I really didn't think too much about that. It's just for me, it was like when I saw one of my colleagues come in a weird way, it was kind of a relief to see them come into my place, because it was almost like subconsciously, I think the mind was going, great, I'm going to be able to dump all this tonight, you know?
Okay.
And I really didn't feel comfortable talking about some of the stuff that I wanted to talk about. I wouldn't even talk about it like here, like in a podcast. And I've opened up quite a lot in my book, but I wouldn't even talk about some of the stuff we talk about, because it's not proper. It's the setting here in a general public is not the proper setting. This is something when I'm talking about black humor, dark humor. So I'm wondering, like, for example, would I talk like that to my wife? And I still probably today I wouldn't. But having said that, I could have said it in a different way. With other colleagues, it was very crude, very raw, but I
Mhm.
could have toned it down to my wife now that I know. But back then, of course, I didn't even understand myself without even understanding why my wife was getting mad at me. I didn't understand that at all. That's the honest truth.
Sure.
She would tell me why, but I could, it's almost like my mind couldn't understand. Well, yeah, but I can't tell you those stories. That's why I'm telling those stories to these people, my colleagues. So at the time, my mind wasn't in the right space, I guess, if you want to call it that way. But yeah, it was definitely subconsciously. Definitely didn't want to hurt my wife, but at the time, I wasn't reasoning the same way that I would reason today.
Yeah. That's interesting, because since that time, you've told that story to the world through your book.
Yeah.
Mhm. The other thing, like we talked a while ago about adrenaline rush, and I found another interesting point in your book. I find so many, every time I look at it, I find something interesting, and something else I want to ask you about. But you talked about that adrenaline rush. If I almost run into somebody's bumper and I have an adrenaline rush, it's temporary, it's over. Yeah, I realize I have a little reaction, but police officers have so many of those, like constantly you have those. You talked about something, and it was when you actually gave chase to, I believe it was a motorcyclist, if I'm not mistaken. And the words you used in your book was, and I wrote them down just so that I wouldn't forget. Reptilian or animalistic side of my brain kicked in. What's that all about?
Well, that's just a word I use from from psychologists I've been seeing.
Okay.
But there's a part of our brain that is very ancient, I guess, or very animalistic, if I can use that word. That you, when you are when the chips are down and you feel, or your mind feels that you're in danger, it reverts back to that, to basically fight off whatever that danger is.
Okay.
Because I'm not moving away from the danger. I keep going towards the danger, right? So that's what it was. But another, I guess, layman term in a sense, it would be tunnel vision. It just basically and if you don't know how to control that, I don't think you can control it. Well, you can't control it up to a certain point. Uh, if you've had experience in that type of field again, for example, here's a primary example. When I arrived in Rishabukto, I had never done any uniform police work, like patrolling the highways, the streets, and all that. My work, my first 5 years was basically, except the Akwesasne, the Oka crisis
Mhm.
moment.
Yep.
Other than that, I was plainclothes, working either drugs or other federal laws. The Quebec Provincial Police were enforcing the Criminal Code of Canada and the provincial law, so we only touched federal laws, including drugs. So not the same type of environment. So when my first experience of checking a car by myself in the middle of the night on a Friday or Saturday night in the middle of nowhere was nerve wracking for me. I did not know what to expect. I did not know if that person would jump out and start pounding on me. I had no clue what was going to happen. So my adrenaline was like sky high at this point. After I was done dealing with the driver, it was almost like I felt nothing in my legs, no more strength in my leg, because the adrenaline rush was crashing. I didn't need that anymore. I didn't need that. My mind didn't need to get that adrenaline rush going, because the danger was, or what my mind perceived as danger, was going away. So
Okay.
now I can relax.
Mhm.
So of course you're shaking, your voice is shaking and all that. Now, 10 years down the road, after I've done many stops, stopping a car right now, like at that time, was just be observant. What's going on? Why is that person moving? Now you're really focused on what's going on. That first time, I only remember stopping the car, talking to the guy a little bit, and the guy going like, I don't even remember. I could, even if you would have asked me 5 minutes after what was the name of the guy, I wouldn't have remembered. I
Mm.
looked at the driver's license, but so nerve wracking for me, I didn't know what
Yeah.
to expect,
Yeah.
that nothing was sticking in my mind. But now, with experience, now this adrenaline rush is not happening anymore.
Mhm.
Or it could be happening. I don't know. I don't know the physiology of a body, but it could be going, but it might be more control. And now the adrenaline is actually funneled into observing, more acute to what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're smelling. Maybe that's the other part of adrenaline.
Mm.
But, and then the other thing, the first time I had to actually use physical force on a subject that we had to arrest, and the subject was resisting, same thing. Adrenaline rush goes sky high, but then you kind of get used to it, because, well, especially where I work, because it was like a regular thing going on. So yeah, so after a while, just somebody, the same person you're dealing with, you probably had physical confrontation, 4 or 5 times. The sixth time, you're going like, okay, come on, buddy. Like, that adrenaline rush doesn't kick in, or it might kick in a different format.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's really
If
interesting.
that makes sense.
Yeah, it certainly does make sense, and it's a very interesting topic as well. Our time is coming close to the end, but I want to ask you one final question, and it'll be sort of a switching of gears, I guess, in a way. We hear so much in the media about policing and images, positive, negative, mostly a lot of negative sometimes. I know growing up, I grew up in a small town where the RCMP detachment was a big presence in my town, and we had a very positive image of RCMP, and that was as a result of the positive things that they did. What are your thoughts on that? Like, where did you engage in the community? Did you go into schools? Did you do things to educate people about, I always grew up thinking RCMP were my friends, and there were great ambassadors for, justice, and maybe that's naive, but there's so many good things that RCMP do. There's so many things that police influence in a positive way. What are your thoughts on that?
Hmm. That's a very good question, actually. I never really put a lot of thought into it, but without putting blame on anywhere, because I think that's the last thing that I would like to do is put blame. Well, it's because of this, because of that. They're given a
Mhm.
negative. I think deep down inside, I still believe that the majority of the population um, is pro police, if I can put
Mhm.
it that
Yeah,
way.
interesting.
I think they're the less vocal ones, but I think if you go to a small community like the one you were brought in, the one I was brought in, because I saw the RCMP the same way you did. They were great
Okay.
ambassadors. They were like coming to schools, giving talks,
Hmm.
and I even got coached 1 year in hockey by an RCMP officer.
Sure.
And it's a great feeling to know that police officers are there and they're kind of part of your community there, and you can talk to them. It's different because when you see a police officer when you don't know them, it's almost like that an invisible type of shield, I guess. That should I go? Maybe not as much today, but in my when I was brought up, that's pretty much the way it was. But to say, yeah, I mean, there are some negative, you know, uh, if you want to put it like on the media platform on different types
Mhm.
of whether it's Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, or the media itself. There are some negative. I don't think it's all bad. I think police officers need to be held accountable. I've got no issues with that. But you need to be careful as well when what type of things you're saying on a social media platform. We all saw it without naming names, but that last shooting, no, might not be the last, but one of the last shootings that happened in the States about that 16-year-old girl that
Mhm.
died from police officers from
Yes.
shooting. I mean, one person that is a public figure right off the bat said, "You're next," and I think we all know
Hmm.
who I'm talking about.
Hmm.
Well, to me, that shows a little bit of irresponsibility from that public figure because imagine, like, put yourself in the shoes of that girl that was pinned against the car getting ready to get stabbed. If I would hear that from a public figure and I'd be the mom or the dad, I'd be some ticked off at this
Hmm.
public figure going like, what are you talking about? Did you want this person to stab my daughter? Is that what you're inferring to? And I'm surprised nobody actually but I guess he got a lot of flack from that. But to me, that's where especially public figures, they have to be careful. We even saw that. Not saying that it made a difference. I don't think it made a difference. But when you look at the Derek Chauvin's trial,
Hmm.
and before the jury came out and gave a verdict, you had two highly placed person from the government of the U.S. that said statements that were like, wow, like almost like if you read it, and I know that's not what they want it to mean, but that's why I'm saying be careful what you're saying because it's almost like inciting violence if the person was found not guilty. And this is coming from high level representative of the government.
Hmm.
So I think that's where we need to take a step back sometimes and really think, like, before people talk, sometimes they should actually look at it, observe it, study it, do some research before actually going and saying something.
Yeah.
Because that's mostly what we see now on social media is negative comments, negative comments, negative comments, and not only about policing, about anything, about government,
Mhm.
COVID-19, everything's negative. People are good at whining. That's a human that's a human factor that we all have inside ourselves. We tend to, I don't know, maybe it's less effort to whine and complain than to try and find a solution.
But
So
there's so much positive there, and maybe we'll focus on that in future conversations. And
yeah,
that positive is probably good for dealing with the things you've had to deal with, and that you explain and talk about so well in Invisible Wounds. Well, thank you, thanks Norm for this, and we're at the end of our time, and I look forward to our next connection. Great to talk with you once again.
always a pleasure, Rick.